Want to see what happens when I mash up 3 vintage patterns from the 60s? Stay tuned. Now, I adore collecting vintage sewing patterns, and I have patterns from the 1910s through to the 1970s. But one of my favorite eras is patterns from the 1960s. So I took 3 patterns that I quite liked and decided to modify them and mash them together to create my very own version of a 1960s shift dress. So to begin with that, let's get into how I drafted the pattern. So I wanted to start off by just sharing some of the inspiration to create this dress. So I actually own these 3 patterns, and they're all from the 1960s. And what I wanted to do was actually mash them up together to create my pattern. So I really liked this option of having a high roll neckline on my dress. So I wanted to incorporate that element from the Simplicity 7346 pattern right here. Next, I absolutely love the style lines and the way that this has just a subtle flare to this shift dress and how it falls just above the knee line there. I also really like these French darts here. Now, that being said, I did not want to do a princess seamed bodice. I wanted to have more of a main piece. So I want to keep these princess darts right here, these French darts right here in the bust line, but I'm going to have a regular side seam like we do on this Simplicity 7072 dress. Now, in this dress, we actually have some darts that are going in at the waist here, coming up to create these style lines. Now, I didn't like that as much as how these princess seams are forming in the butterick version. So what I wanted to do is create some waist shaping using the same darts that, in fact, this dress uses along the back, where it shapes the back with some waist darts here. I'm going to do the exact same thing within the front, but also maintaining that French dart right here. Now, in terms of the sleeves, obviously, if I'm making this up as a pattern, do let me know if you want me to turn this into a pattern. I would definitely do the 3 sleeve options of being sleeveless, a 3/4, maybe even a full bracelet length, as well as a short sleeved version. Now, right now, as we are speaking, I have yet to draft this pattern, and I am toying between the sleeveless and the short sleeve version, and I'm thinking I'm going to go with the short sleeved version here. Now, another element that I really liked about this dress in particular was these belt details here. So I just thought we would zoom in just a little bit so that we can see this a bit better. So we have a back belt detail with some button closures, which I think is really fab. That being said, I also really like this belt here. So this belt here is actually cut in 2 pieces, and you're just creating a nice belt placket that does up along the back. The one thing that would annoy me is the fact that, yes, you'd have to zip into your dress, but when you have these, you're also going to have to button it up, and that's just one extra step. So what I am thinking I'm going to do is actually this front belt. And what this belt is it's actually a small rouleau loop that is cut on the bias so it stretches. And the fabric that I am using, which is from Modes for You, actually is a stretch knit. Now, it is a stable knit, but because it does have that stretch, depending on where I cut it along the grain line, I'm still going to get that stretch along the waistline. Now, if I made this out of a woven fabric, I most certainly would cut this on the bias, but having these small little tubes with a nice self-fabric covered button, I think would look really nice in the front of this. So now that we have my inspiration for the patterns all set, I thought that we would look at how I would alter the patterns. So I have just placed here the line drawings of what these pattern pieces look like from the instruction booklets. Now, these are definitely not the exact pattern pieces, so I would never use them for measurements. That being said, it gives me a good idea of how I might want to modify certain sleeve lengths to get where I'd like it to be, as well as how these pattern pieces are being formed. These are very simple pattern pieces. I have right here, we can just click on this. This is my very basic block. Now this one here, I included the seam allowances on here. It's a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I do have my French dart as well as my waist shaping in here. Now, in order to create these blocks, you basically take your regular bodice block that you would draft and your regular skirt block, and you combine them into two. I've had these for many years. If you would like to see how I create mine, do let me know in the comments down below. I am happy to do a quick tutorial on how to draft them both on paper, as well as if you have a program like Adobe Illustrator, which I am using right here to draft them. Now, one thing to note, I also include some shaping in the back along a dart that goes in the neckline. I was toying with either putting it in the shoulder seam or in the neckline, but I think that I like the style lines of how we are going to have this dart kind of pointing outwards. I think it'll look really nice. So I have my back piece already drafted, and this one is drafted with just a little bit of ease. We are definitely going to have to slope this out, but I wanted to walk you through how I would go about doing that. So on the one side, I have all of my different layers here. I've got my pattern edits on the top, and then I've got my original drafting blocks that I have right in here, and changes that I have made to my original block. So this was based on my measurements, and then I stitch it up, and when I make changes, because I notice I need to take in the bust dart here and there, that's where I have that. Right here, we've got the guidelines for my waist and my hip. I like to make sure that these are always lined up so that I can gauge how I am drafting that pattern in terms of where my skirt is lying. So I always like to have that there. That being said, what I am doing here in Illustrator, you can do the exact same thing on your block using a pencil and some paper. So let's get into it. So to start, I wanted to take the measurements from the patterns. Now, these patterns are all in different sizes, so you will have to bear that in mind, especially if you're working with your own vintage patterns that are in different sizes. But it gives you a nice reference point just depending on what those finished garment sizes are. So for this one here, I am measuring the length of the sleeve from the top of the sleeve cap down to the end, and I am not including any of the seam allowances. And the great thing about vintage patterns is they include the seam allowances on these printed patterns, so you don't have to worry about subtracting that later on. I also want to find out what the width of the sleeve is, both at the underarm seam as well as the bottom of the sleeve. So in this instance, I am going to measure the entirety of the sleeve. So if at a later date I want to make a longer sleeve, I still have all of these measurements. Now I'm also measuring the dart placement here. And one of the things I love about vintage patterns with their sleeves is they always like to put a dart within the sleeve, and you don't see that a lot in modern designs. And I really like how it creates some nice shaping to it. So what I've done here is I've actually just transferred on, just overlaid over that screenshot of the instructions, what those measurements are based on the pattern. So I measured all of these pattern pieces here. This is the underarm sleeve here going down, and you can see that from the center front to the center back, we have about 1/4 of an inch longer in the center back than in the center front, obviously to accommodate for those curves of your bottom here. So next, I also wanted to measure from the waistline to the hem in the pattern pieces, just so that I have that for reference. Now, the important measurements here are going to be these bottom ones here, so that we know how much we should flare out that pattern, give or take a little, but it gives you a good idea of where you want it to be. So I have just gone ahead and measured these, all of them, with no seam allowances, of course. So the next thing that we need to do is look at all of those measurements here on the sleeve. So from the top to the bottom here, as well as right across that sleeve cap. So I just wanted to share with you all of these measurements that I am taking. And then I also looked at taking a measurement that goes from straight across that sleeve cap and then up to where it goes, as well as that dart placement, how far up from the bottom and how far out and apart those dart legs are. So I know it's a lot of measuring, but it starts to build this baseline for how you can go and modify your own bodice block to create your own pattern. You don't have to follow it steadfast, and obviously these are different sizes than what I am, so it is going to be just a little bit different when I go to draft it, but it gives me a good idea of what I want. So right here, I thought I would calculate the hem here. So I am just going to take that 9.5 inches on the center back plus the 9 inches on the side panel and the 7.25 inches on the center front. Now I'm multiplying all of these by 2 because that will give the entire circumference of the hem of the dress, and what that works out to be is 51.5 inches. Now, we don't need that when we're drafting a pattern. So the easy step would be to divide this by 2, but I am just going to go ahead and rewrite this out because I like to have my math on my page for me so that I know where I was thinking and where I got these numbers from. So I'm just going to go ahead and type in that 9.5 plus the 9 inches plus the 7.25 inches, and that gives us a total of 25.75 inches for that bottom hemline. That way we have an idea of how we want to flare out that A-line on the skirt. So I'm just going to drag this up and delete that other calculation that I did. And I always love to have these just sitting there so that I can ever go back and understand what I did and where I got those calculations when I'm drafting it on that bodice block. So when we go ahead and look at the bodice block here, this is where we can start to make some of those adjustments and changes. I'm just grabbing the pen tool. If you're drafting this with a pen and paper, you can go ahead and just use your pencil to draw in some of these new lines that we're going to be putting in here. And so you can see I've drawn this line to measure when there's no seam allowance. It's 9.782 inches. And I'm just going to delete that, and then I'm going to measure this side. So you can use your ruler if you're doing it on paper. I am using the pen tool just because it is nice and quick to do this in Illustrator. Doing it this way, I don't have to cut any of the lines that are already drawn and attached to find that out. And this one here is 11.2979, and I'm just going to delete that because we don't need any of those additional lines in here. And so I'm also going to write in here how much we have so that I know how I need to change that flare. And then I'm going to do the exact same one here so that we know exactly what we're going to be doing and how we're going to change that. So next we need to find out the overall hem allowance in this sloper. So to do that, I am going to add these two numbers together. So we have the 9.8 plus the 11.3, and that is going to equal 21.1 inches. And now that we have that, we need the 25.75 inches. So with that, then we know how much we need to add to that hem to create that A-line flare. So 25.75 minus the 21.1 inches, and that will give us 4.65 inches that we need to add in. And so to do that, I am going to add that to the bottom of the skirt, and I'm just going to add my notes in here for future reference on that. So next up, I just wanted to show you that we are going to flare out this skirt here. So the way in which we're going to do that is we are just going to move some of these bottom points here. So I'm actually taking that 4.65 inches and I'm dividing that by 2 because our pattern is of course in half. We're only going to be drafting half of the dress, so we need to figure that out, and that's about 2.3 inches that we need to move out. So now that we have that, when you're working on your paper piece, you can just draw this in, but I'm going to show you how I do it in Illustrator here. So I'm just hitting Control-Shift-M or going to the Move function, and it has the option to do horizontal and vertical changes here. So I am just going to move it horizontally, and you choose either negative or positive values to move it to the right or the left, respectively. And if you are doing this on paper, it is that much easier because all you need to do is just move that point out and then use your ruler to match up those points here. So you can see I've got a bit of a dip going down by the hip here. So I'm actually just deleting that line and then I'm going to redraw it from the waistline here. So I'm just going in here and then I'm going to drag these little legs out so I get a slight curve. Now, if you're drawing this with a ruler, you can use a long French curve ruler and just get a nice gentle curve in there so that you have something that isn't just too angular and triangular. And then you can see right in here that we've got that nice curve going in. And now we're going to do the same thing along here. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually just joining these together. So I'm averaging those 2 points and then joining them. That way we don't have any issues when we go in here. I'm just adding in my seam allowances and I go to the object and adding in the offset lines here. Now, because I didn't fully join all of the points, I'm getting some inner lines here that you don't necessarily want. If you are drawing this on paper, all you need to do is add in your seam allowances. So now we have the front piece drafted. So let's get that flare for the back piece here. So with the back piece, we're going to do the same thing, the Control-Shift-M to move that point. And we're going to move the points along the side seams and not the center front or center back on our pattern pieces. So you can see here how I am moving those points in different areas. I thought my screen was recording the pop-up so that you could see where I was moving them, but it's only recording the one screen here. But you still get that idea. And once again, I am going in and straightening up this line here. And then I need to go in and just join those lines together before going ahead and adding back in those seam allowances. So you want to make sure that you also have on this back piece the seam allowance going along the center back, because of course there's going to be a seam there, so we can insert our back center lap zipper in there. And so I am just grabbing this. I'm actually just cutting this here because right here I wanted to check the length. So you can just use your ruler and measure that. If you're working in a digital space like this, you can either cut that line and check that object or draw a line to see how many inches that is. So I'm just drawing a line here from my waistline down to the hem because I just want to see if it is indeed that 9.8 inches that we had looked at from that pattern, just to see about where that length is. That being said, do adjust the length to where you feel comfortable and what fits your unique body shape. And you can do that quite easily using that same move tool or just extending those points downward if you're drafting on paper. So next up here, I am just looking at my sleeve here. And so what I'm going to do is I just drew a line, and if you're working on paper, take your ruler out or your tape measure and measure a line for the length of that sleeve. Do not include those seam allowances, and you can see this is where I want it to end, which is just above where I have that elbow length on my drafting sloper here. So I am going to shorten this up. Now, as I had mentioned before, I am going to be doing some short sleeves. So this second line here is for where that short sleeve is going to end. That being said, if I do decide to turn this into a pattern for all of you so you don't have to draft your own, I still wanted to have that bracelet length sleeve option on the longer version. I'm just actually highlighting the entire bottom. So I'm going in here and I am just going to drag it up to where the end of that point is for that short sleeve. And so all you need to do on that, if you're doing it on paper, is to just draw a line across there. So these dotted lines I have on my sloper, it's what I use when I draft my sleeve slopers so that I can slash and spread them. I was just deleting a couple of those lines because I'm not going for a puff sleeve. I want it to be more of a fitted sleeve. I don't have to worry about that. That being said, I do want to extend my sleeve out just a little bit so it's not skin tight like what my sloper has. So I want the width at the bottom to be this 13 inches in here. And I am just figuring out how much the actual sleeve for my sloper is and how much wider I want my sleeve, which is almost 1 inch, which means I just need to extend it just slightly by that 0.996 inches. I'm dividing that by 2 because I want to split it up on the front and the back. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use that same move tool. I am dragging over those lines, Control-Shift-M to move them over. So I am moving them over just horizontally, not vertically, so no up or down movement. You can do that with your ruler as well. Just measure those points out and do it equally on the front and the back. Now, the reason I am doing it equally on each side of the sleeve is because I have a slightly different shape in the back and the front of my sleeve based on how I drafted my sloper. Certain slopers, you're going to have a sleeve shape that is going to be the same in the front and the back. And in this sloper that I drafted, it is different. So I really want to make sure that I am spreading out that fullness evenly. So right here, I've actually just clipped that line and you can't see the pop-up boxes where it is actually showing me how long that line is. But you would take your tape measure and you would just measure right along the curve there to get how big that is. So the next thing that I'm doing here is I am just going to line up my sleeve piece, and I'm lining it up not on the seam allowance, but on the actual seam line that you would be stitching on. And I am just walking it along my pattern piece. Now you can do this with your flat pattern that you're drafting on paper. I am just using my rotate tool here in Illustrator so that I can go ahead and do that. And you can see that my notches are not lining up because I have changed the shape of the sleeve. So I want to go back and change those notches. But for right now, I need to see exactly how much or less I need to increase or decrease that sleeve curve so that it does match up without having any gathers. Now you still want to have a little bit of ease, so it's okay if it's just slightly larger because you can gather it in without actually creating any pleats or puckers. So you can see I've got a decent amount here. So what I am doing here is I am just going to cut in that place and I am going to make a mark for how far out it is within there, and then I'm going to measure that. Now, if you're using this on paper, you can just measure what that distance is and adjust it. But I'm just showing you how I do this. Digitally, I'm removing all those seam allowances because I don't need them. And you can see I'm adjusting the curve. You would use your French curve ruler if you were doing this on paper, just so you can get that nice curve, or you can freehand it because heck, I've drafted so many patterns on paper and have just freehanded it to get that nice gentle curve once you kind of get that feeling. And so I am just double checking all of those measurements to see if they match up. So you can see that I am double checking it on the front first. The next step after it does start to match up on the front is we will then move to the back of that sleeve. And so just continue to walk these pieces up and down the pattern piece just so you can start to kind of see where everything is going. And we're off just slightly on here. And so I can just go ahead and continue to tweak this pattern for you and going in. So I thought that I would just skip that because it takes a little bit of time. And next I want to find out the neckline edge. So right here, I am just measuring the point. So you can see I'm cutting it and I am just checking in the document info how long each of those areas are within that, not including the dart. Now you can just use your tape measure if you're doing this on a flat pattern. Now, if you want to see me drafting this on paper because it might be a little bit easier, do let me know. I am happy to do a tutorial on that. This is just the method that I tend to use when I am drafting patterns because it's a lot quicker for me. So I'm just doing my math here where I'm adding up the back and the front neckline to get the total neckline edge because we wanted to have that collar. So this is what this little black square is. I need to go in and change that, but you're going to create a rectangle here for that. And it's up to you in terms of how tall you want yours to be. I do believe I made mine 6 inches tall, and that's including my seam allowance and folding it in half, because with this neckband, you want to make sure that you are folding it in half and there's no extra bulky seams on that. And so that dotted line symbolizes that. And then I'm just going in and I'm adding all of my pattern information. I always like to include that, even if it's something that I'm just quickly drafting. That way I know exactly what all the pattern pieces are. And if I leave this pattern for a little bit and then decide to come back, then I can really know what I was thinking when I was originally drafting this pattern. I also always like to include my dogs or degree of greatest stretch so that I know when I'm cutting out my pattern pieces which direction the stretch needs to be in. So you can see here, I am back going to my sleeve pattern here, and I am just adjusting where I'm going to be placing these notches here, as well as having just a little bit of room at the top to have that ease in the sleeve cap, which you want. And you can have anywhere from, 1/8 of an inch to about 1/2 an inch without having to worry about receiving any of those puckering when you're actually stitching it up. I'm just making a little bit of adjustments here, adding in my seam allowances as well as those notches that I like to have so that I can place everything beautifully. And so you can see I have that all drafted here, and we've got the neckline here with that beautiful roll neck that we had drafted. And one thing that I'm just going in here, I realize that I don't like how sharp these seams are at the waist. I am going to create a more gentle curve here. So what I'm doing, I'm just removing my seam allowance here, and then I am going in here. I am grabbing that point in the middle. Make sure those points are joined if you are in Illustrator, and then you'll see a little dot and you just pull out and it gives a nice gentle curve. And this is very easily done with your ruler if you are going ahead and drafting this on paper. So just go ahead, add back in those seam allowances where you need them. And I know a lot of people do put in these seam allowances along where the dart is. I actually leave mine open. It's just how I've always learned when I was drafting patterns. But just in case it gets confusing, you may want to draw those lines in by the dart so that you don't actually cut out that dart when you're cutting out your main pattern pieces, if you're someone that potentially might forget that. So I am just adding in that waistline so that I know in future reference where exactly that is, especially because if I'm moving this pattern around and I don't have those red guidelines showing me where my bust point is and my waist point is, then I really want to make sure that I know where it is. Now that we've modified our basic dress sloper to match those style details of my existing patterns, great thing about this is even if you don't have the patterns, you can take a look at some of those elements and actually draft your own. I do own these patterns, but they're not always in the right size. So by using a standard dress sloper, it can really help for you to create something very similar. So one thing that I needed to do as well was actually reduce my dress block by the percentage of stretch that is in my fabric. Now I didn't do this at first and ended up having to go back and take it in, which you will see in the footage as I stitch it together. So if you do have a knit garment and you're using a sloper for a woven dress, just be sure to go in and reduce that a little bit so it fits a little bit tighter to the body. If you're using a woven fabric, the method I just showed you is perfectly fine. The fabric I decided to use is from Modes for You, and it is a beautiful knit Japanese fabric with these gorgeous orange and yellow blossoms on it, and I really thought that it just screamed 1960s and was perfect for this inspired dress. I will link everything down below that I used as well. So let's get to actually constructing this dress. So to start, I am just laying out my pattern pieces that we had just drafted here, and I'm just cutting this out, and you can see that I'm cutting this one out on the fold. And now for the neck collar and the sleeve. So my sleeve here, because the fabric width isn't as long, I actually cut it off grain, which isn't too bad. It didn't have any stretching and I didn't mind that, but I was able to use up nearly every single scrap of this fabric. There's not even enough to make a scrunchie. So I'm just transferring all of these notches because my sleeve does have a distinct front and back. I really want to make sure that I'm matching those up. And so you can see I'm just notching into it because my fabric doesn't fray. The next step is we are going to transfer the rest of the pattern markings, including the darts. So we do have the darts that go in both the front and the back. So we have this shoulder dart here, which I really like for my style details. And then this one right here in my waist dart, which creates some really nice shaping along here. And so I'm actually just marking that center line of the dart for my waistline just because I like to know where it is. I fold them right sides together. So if you've ever done a double-sided dart here like this, you will know that it works almost the same as a regular dart. I'm just placing my pins in right along the lines, and you can see how I'm flipping it back and forth. This is to see and double check that my pin is going through along the line on the other side. Then you know everything's going to line up. And so I am just going to pin this in place and then stitch along both sides. And I'm going to repeat that for the other dart right here. And on these types of darts, you want to start where the legs of this dart begin and then go towards the point. So you can see here, I'm actually pulling up my thread tails here. You want 2 long thread tails. Do not backstitch. You will get excess bulk that you do not want. And so then continue to go, and right at this point where I drew that cross line, that's where I'm going to pivot just slightly and then continue off. And like you would with any other dart, clip it so there's long tails, no back stitches. And then we are going to knot this 2 or 3 times to secure those thread tails. This is to help reduce bulk and create a nice crisp dart. And you're going to do that on both ends of that double-sided dart. Nice and easy, right? Next, I'm going to press them. I'm pressing the bust dart or the bust darts down and the ones that are double-sided towards the center of the garment. And then I pressed upwards for the shoulder darts there. Next, I've got those waist ties that are a decorative piece here. I'm just placing these 2 pieces right sides together, and I stitched and serged it. And I found the easiest way to do this is either with a bodkin, or what I am using is my safety pin, because for the life of me, I cannot find my bodkin. I think I need to do a declutter and organize in my sewing room so I can find all of those notions that I constantly look for. So with this, I am just placing this on here. I've marked where that waist seam is, and then I'm going to place it here. So I have just set this in place, and I'm going to attach that with some pins. Now I did it the exact same width as what the front is, and what I noticed when I was wearing it is it does kind of gap a little bit because this is a knit. I think that I could have gotten away with making it slightly more narrow than the front of it. And you can see right here, I'm actually twisting it so that it gives a nice twist detail with the button in the center. I like that so much more. Not what the pattern had, but what my personal preference was. So after just basting those sides in place, I trimmed off the excess, and I'm finding the center of both of these pieces. And I'm just going to use a water-soluble marker to just mark that. You could use a pen if you don't have a marker handy. And once I have that done, I am going to crisscross them exactly as I want them. And then I am going to put on my button. So I like to use a double length of thread as opposed to a single, and then I wax my thread because it really helps with it. And what you don't see off camera is I actually used my iron to press that wax into the thread. It creates a stronger thread, as well as the ability for it to glide and not knot as much as you would if you were just using your regular thread. So once that is secure, the front is complete, and we can attach the front to the back at the shoulder seams. So I'm just going to match this up, and based on your pattern drafting, if you have done it correctly, it should match up absolutely perfectly. So I am just stitching this in place with the seam allowance that I put on my pattern when I was drafting it. And then I am going to use my overlocker or serger and serge those edges. Then I'm going to press that to the back of the dress. Now for the sleeve. So because we do have a sleeve that has both a definitive front and back, do match up the double notches to the back and the single notches to the front, and that one middle single notch in the sleeve, well, of course, that one is our shoulder seam. And then we're just going to match the rest up, and it should fit absolutely perfectly because we double and triple checked our math in terms of how big of a sleeve cap we needed. And then I'm just going to stitch and then serge this up. I've already done the other side here. It should look like this, no puckers anywhere. And you can see this short little sleeve all there. Now for the side seams. So I like to first match up the underarm seam right here by the sleeve, and then I'll go down and match the rest of the bottom of the dress. And I am just pinning it in place, making sure that the dart that I have in the front for the bust dart is pointing downward so I don't get any puckering or anything here. You can see I've serged that, and this is what this side looks like when it's all stitched. Now, I decided not to finish the end of this with an overlocker stitch because number one, this is a knit fabric and it doesn't fray. And number two, I am going to be using my cover stitch to finish this. Now, the reason I'm using my cover stitch is I want a stitch that is going to be stretchy, and it does the same thing as a serged edge along the bottom. That being said, if you don't have a cover stitch machine, one thing that you can use is a stretch twin needle. So if you're using a knit fabric, make sure it is a stretch, and that will give you a nice finished detail. Here is my cover stitch. I'm using the two wide set ones because I tend to like the look of that the best. Little trick on your cover stitch to take it out, use a pair of tweezers to pull it out and then cut the threads. It makes it so much easier than that back and forth that you have to do. Next, for the cover stitch, you have to make sure that you take those threads that are on the front right side of your fabric and bring them to the back so we can knot it off, because of course we cannot backstitch with a cover stitch machine. So I'm just threading this through just a large needle, bringing them all towards the back, and then all I like to do is just knot this 3 times to secure those threads. And once I've got them all secured and tied together, then I go ahead and knot them all together and clip the edges. And we have our sleeves all hemmed nicely. Next, we have the collar piece. I'm just folding this in half, and then I'm going to mark my center front. And so I'm just marking that with a pin, and I'm going to find my center front here, and I'm going to attach this right sides together. And then I'm going to attach my collar to either end. And the reason we're not stitching this in a total loop is because, of course, we have that zip going down the back. And I am just stitching that in, and then I went ahead and overlocked it. Next, I am going to be pressing the seam allowance down towards the bodice of the dress, just so everything sits nicely. You could top stitch this if you want. I decided not to do that. And then I am going to interface where we are going to put the invisible zipper in. Whether it is a stretch or a woven fabric, if you are installing a zipper, you always have to interface that. And so I'm just tearing it off just below where my zipper is going to end, because it doesn't need to go all the way to the bottom. What this does is it prevents your fabric and garment from gaping, especially if you're using a knit fabric. You really want to make sure that you stabilize that edge there. And once that is done, we can go ahead with our invisible zipper. I like to press my invisible zipper so that the teeth go open a little bit, which is why you see it go very much in that V shape when it was zipped up. So I am just going here and I am placing my zipper. And the way that I did my seam allowance on this is I made sure it was the exact amount that my zipper teeth is for my zipper, so that I can line up the raw edge of my fabric to my zipper. Makes it so much easier. I'm just attaching my zipper foot. Don't forget to backstitch at the top and the bottom of the garment here. And we have our zipper installed, well, at least on the one side. So then the next thing that we need to do is the other side. So you can see that I made sure to tuck in those edges. And I'm just marking here where the zipper ends as well as where that seam is on the collar, because if that is not lined up, it is not going to look very professional. And so the way that I go about doing that is I match up that line on the zipper with the line of the collar, and that is where I know it's going to match. And then I can go ahead and wrap my zipper around along the top And then just go down the bottom as you normally would, like we did on the other side. And then we're just going to pop over to the machine and stitch that in place just like we did the first side of the zipper, stopping right at that mark and going all the way to the top, making sure that you fold over that tab. So you can see it looks just like so. I'm just going to go and zip it up. Next, we got to finish the bottom half here. So with this, I'm just pinning this in place. Now I'm being very careful over by the zipper to make sure everything is lying flat, because we're going to stitch at the bottom and then we're going to stitch right beside that zipper. So see how it's just a little bit above that? And that is how you get a nice, beautiful, seamless finish on that invisible zipper. I'm using the iron to press open those seams, and our dress looks just like so. We are almost done. We're at the home stretch now, guys. The last thing we need to do is the hem. So I am rolling up my hem once again that 1/2 inch, because that is my magic number for my cover stitch machine, but you can create whatever size hem that you would like. And if you are using your twin needle, be sure to use that as well. You want this hem to be able to have that stretch if you're using a moderately stretchy fabric as well. Also, the 2 lines of stitching is really nice on a hemline. And so this is what it looks like, all nice and finished here. You can see we've got the belt in place, and I am so excited to put this dress on for you and show you the final reveal.
Let it go, what's the use in holding on? Can we find a way where we could spend some time alone? You know where to find me, you know which way to go. As long as you love me, we'll be singing all night long. So take a minute to hold me. I want nothing more than your arms and to be your baby tonight.
There you have it. Your dress is all completed. Now, I kept the zipper in this dress, even though it's a knit fabric, because it is a more stable knit, meaning it doesn't stretch a ton, and I wanted to be able to have a nice, easy way to get in and out, as well as show you how to make this in a woven as well. I really hope you enjoyed this, and if you love vintage fashions and would like to see more content from different decades, just comment down below which decade you would like to see for my next video. Until next time, makers, let's get our sewspiration on.